Okay, welcome everybody, and thank you for attending part 2 of the cultural series in dementia put on by the Brown County Dementia Friendly Community Coalition. We have a subcommittee of the coalition that works to provide educational opportunities for the community wherever you are and on various topics. And so this fall we picked the cultural element with dementia. And my name is Sherry. I am the Dementia Care Specialist in Brown County, and I am joined by other members of the committee, including Laura Nolan, who you will hear. She's with UWGB, and Debbie Miller's with Oneida Tribe. Today we have presenters Mary Wolf and Elaina Seep, who will introduce themselves. Take it away.
Sherry, thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you to the committee for inviting us to present with you today. My name is Mary Wolf, and I am the program director for the Aging and Disability programs through Great Lakes InterTribal Council, and we provide services to all of the tribes in Wisconsin. So I'd like to share a little bit about what we've been working on. Is Great Lakes InterTribal Council is one of 4 grantees for the ACL ADPI grant, which is the Alzheimer's Disease and Prevention Initiative. And this was part of a tribal only ACL grant. North Dakota, Alaska, and Oklahoma were the other 3 that were awarded this. And with just this year, Arizona was also awarded an ADPI grant. We are currently partnering with Oneida. That's how we're in touch with Debbie, and Menominee, Lac du Flambeau, Mole Lake, St. Croix, Ho Chunk, and Le Coudray. Le Coudray, I see roses on. They have their own ACL ADPI grant, and they are also one of our partners at Glitzy. And one of our projects, or the main project that we're working on, is Amber Hoon is actually online with us, and she's heading this up, is to bring Savvy Caregivers program in Indian country training to the tribal dementia care specialists in Wisconsin, and partners along with adapting state and nationwide materials to the tribal cultural perspective of our partnering tribes. So that's what we're up to. Elaina?
Thanks, Mary. Hi, I'm Elaina Seep. And if you'd been on earlier when apparently my video was working, you could see how fantastic my lipstick looks today because I put on lipstick to be in a presentation. So anyway, I'm Elaina Seep, and I am the CEO and project lead for Aniwa Consulting Services. We're based here in Wisconsin, and we exclusively work with tribal nations. We've been doing that since 2017. However, prior to that, I was working actually for the state out of the Bureau of Long-Term Care, at least that's what they were calling themselves at that point, on the Money Follows the Person Tribal Initiative. It was a big eye-opener to see all of the technical assistance that tribes need and places where there were a lot of equity gaps when it came to programming, technical assistance, funds, and then the general experience that clients were having in aging and disability services. So we're also a partner, well, we're the contractors. Mary and Amber tell me what to do, and then my people say, yes, ladies. And we're helping them with their adaptive materials for their ADPI grant, which they've named Together Strong. That together, the tribal communities are much stronger together than apart to address Alzheimer's and dementia and the struggles that people have. We do work with other tribes nationwide and give some presentations. Mary and I actually worked this up. Has it been 2 years now that we?
I believe so.
It seems weird to say that, but we've given this presentation a few times in a few different ways, and I'm glad that we were asked to bring it here, and and we added some pieces that were more relevant to the dementia experience, but overall talking about what that tribal health equity experience is here in Wisconsin. So thank you for bringing us on today. So I think, I bet I could advance that slide, huh? I'm sleeping on the top.
It's like, I don't have the controls.
Right. Very like, wait, and then it went to, okay, there we go. Can you see the many tribes, one people? All right, there we are. Yes, we're in business.
Yes. Okay. So there's 566 federally recognized Native American tribes in the United States. And what that means to have that federal recognition, that's what gives the tribes their sovereign status as a self-governing indigenous nation within the United States. Federal recognition is required for the majority of federal laws and other provisions to apply to a tribe. Even though there are nearly 200 distinct languages across Indian country, there is no one single word for dementia. One of the important tasks of Great Lakes Intertribal Council staff was determined was needed for Together Strong was working with local language speakers to create a description for what dementia is. For example, in our Ojibwe language, we talk about how things are as an action or how it happens. One way to describe memory loss in Ojibwe may be to talk about a person who walks in both past and present worlds.
So we mentioned here a little bit about the termination period, and not everybody realizes that there are actually 12 tribes in Wisconsin. The 12th tribe is the Brotherton tribe, who migrated to Wisconsin along with members of Stockbridge, Munsee, and Oneida Nation, leaving New England as settlers, and then they were continually pushed westward as a lot of those early tribes from that New England area were. However, in 1839, Brotherton was actually the first tribe in the entire country to accept United States citizenship under that 1839 treaty. However, they were terminated in what's called the termination period in the mid 1950s. Now we'll talk a little more about what the termination period is and what that means, but it essentially ended their status in the federal government's eyes of being an organized Indian tribe and having all of the provisions that would mean as a government and to their people as tribal members. So Brotherton, being one of those 3 New England-based tribes, had been identified at around the same time in the 1950s. I'm sure it was just a coincidence that all 3 tribes were owed over $300 million in Indian land claim settlements, and all 3 of them were actually targeted for termination at around that same period in the 1950s to 60s. So Brotherton has been continually denied reinstatements by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, because once the tribe was terminated like that, they actually had to appeal to have themselves reinstated in other words, to have the federal government re-recognize them as a tribe and as a nation. So the government has continuously used the acceptance of the tribe's citizenship under that 1839 treaty as a reason for why they were dissolved as a tribe. However, there is no dissolution language in that 1839 citizenship treaty, yet Brotherton continues to this day to petition for reinstatement. So the reason that this and other things that we're going to present to you throughout this talk are important is that these are things for us to remember as we look through that window of Alzheimer's and dementia, that this is not ancient history, that this is not something that happened to people far away and in a far away time. Your clients, their families, our elders and loved ones lived this. 1950, that's pretty much in the range for at least my parents, my grandparents, and I'm 48. So that's not that long ago. And all of these different aspects of inequity and trauma and assimilation and the other things we'll talk about absolutely color and impact the experiences of people suffering from memory loss and other symptoms of dementia and Alzheimer's in Indigenous communities. I believe this one's you, Mary. Did it forward? There we go.
It forwarded. Yeah, so there are 3 principles of cultural informed services, as you can see. There is the congruency, which is the application of practices in agreement with preferred cultural values, beliefs, and practices of a people. There's the competence, the process by which we demonstrate or deliver culturally congruent practices. And then there's the sensitivity, or the awareness and understanding of cultural differences and similarities that enable better service to people within their unique communities, which is what we are helping with today.
And it's important, and I'm glad that Mary broke this down like this, because I have to confess, and especially as someone who's worked with the state before, that there's a lot of talk around cultural competence as if it's just one thing and one word. And really, there are many different aspects to what that means, which is congruency, like how you deliver it, that awareness being the sensitivity. So it's really good to understand what those principles really mean when we talk about having culturally informed care or service for your Native clients. Really, for any client who has a culture different than your own. So a little bit about treaties, because you really cannot talk about tribes as a nation, as a government, and the indigenous experience without talking about treaties, because they really are the law of the land. And we broke this down to kind of give you some snippets to refer back to. And I'm pretty sure that we don't have a problem sharing this PowerPoint if anyone wants copies of it. But treaties were in exchange for territory. So treaty making has been around, actually, the first ones have been around since the 1660s, always over rights and boundaries. And I can't think today, so pardon me. Let me reset my brain. I need more caffeine. So, but one of the things that we want to make sure everyone understands is that tribal lands were not given away without a price. Tribal people and their governments, before they were organized into what we think of now with tribal presidents or chairmen and women or a council, whatever structure existed way back when has always been a community with leadership. And they understood that they were giving something away and getting something in return. So lands like Milwaukee were not free. There was a promise back to tribes in exchange for that territory of having their generation, the generation after that, and in perpetuity, things like healthcare and wellness and other provisions for tribes were all promised in these treaties without an expiration date. Because it wasn't like at some point the United States would give the land back. So these treaties are still in operation today. So when you hear someone talk about treaty rights, and especially when it comes to health and wellness, they really are referencing these treaties that were made as far back as the 16, 17, 1800s until the time that treaty making ceased. The government also formally uses those treaties to recognize that responsibility for healthcare, but it also recognizes that tribes are a separate government, separate than a state, certainly separate than a county, and separate than the United States government. So within the Constitution, tribes are specifically named as being outside of what we consider of the Union, which is what makes up the United States piece, in Article 1, Section 2, Article 1, Section 8, and then again in the 14th Amendment. And I want to say it's Article 1, Section 2, and Section 8 is where it's the commerce treaties, which essentially say that only the United States government can make a treaty or an act of commerce with an outside government, and they include Indian tribes in that definition of a government that exists outside of the United States. The other reason that this is important is that with tribes being individual governments, there are special provisions that exist today within federal law that are current and present, as well as those older treaties that give certain protections to tribal members in different programs. Like when we talk about Title VI, which is the tribal equivalent to Title III, tribes are allowed to set their own age. It's not 60 and older the way it's defined for Title III. It's whatever age a tribe sets that someone's an elder in their community. These are some other just examples of other acts where tribal members have specific provisions that apply to them because they are the member of a federally recognized Indian tribe.
However, I would like to touch on that just a little bit, Elaina.
Yeah.
Title VI, although they are able to serve people at the age that their tribe determines is an elder. Their funding is still based only on elders that are 60 years of age and older. Just wanted to throw that in there.
No, that's a really good and important point, because we talk about that all the time. Essentially, what that does for tribal nations is that if you are a tribe with a significant gap in really in longevity, because tribes continue to lag behind the general population of non-native people by at a minimum 5 years, meaning they pass away 5 years earlier than their non-native counterparts. And really, that's just a general number across the entire United States. Depending on the region you're in, that number is skewed, and it gets bigger in certain areas where it's more rural, or you have less tribal resources or less developed support systems. And so what that does is, by saying that, oh, if you're a tribal elder at 55, which is the age of most, but not all of the tribes in Wisconsin, I think Ho-Chunk Nation and maybe one or two others set their age at 60, but the majority of them set it at 55. So it really creates an unfunded mandate for those tribal aging Title VI programs to serve people from 55 to 59 without any other funding, and still serve people 60, but they're based only on 60 and up. So if they have 50 people who are over the age of 60, but they have 200 people that are age 55 to 59, they're only getting funded based on the 50 people that make that OAA funding formula of 60 and older. So it's another reason why it's important for them to be able to have a good coordination with Title III, because then that allows the tribe to preserve those limited Title VI dollars for those people that are under the age of 60.
Thank you.
Yes.
There was a Chippewa delegation that was sent for the treaty signing. And this photo here that we're showing is the delegation. And right in the middle, the very tall man that's sitting on the chair, looks like he's sitting on a child's chair. He is a hereditary chief, Akiwenzi, and his name is Bagweosh, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Anyway, he is my great grandfather, and he was one of the treaty signers that actually walked the perimeter of the Lakota Reservation to ensure that we had running water, waters in their hunting grounds, make sure that we would be able to sustain ourselves within that reservation land.
Right. So when we say that the land that was given wasn't given for nothing, tribes are very aware that they were limiting themselves to what they'd had before. And like Mary said, these elders and leaders were walking the perimeter of the different areas to make sure that their people were taken care of. So we wanted to give you a timeline of and I think I started to talk about it earlier when I shouldn't have, because I looked at my notes wrong. So we wanted to give you a timeline of treaty making and policy in the US. And it's much greater than people think of, with the first treaties being made in the 1660s. But from 1778 to 1871, that's when it's really considered the peak of what historically would be called the treaty making period between the US government and all Native American tribes across the country and different indigenous communities in the country. And I say indigenous because I learned something new after all of these years of working with tribal nations. Alaskans do not like to be referred to as Native or tribal because they have a different structure. They're not tribes in the same way that the lower 48s are. And during the height of discrimination, there were signs all over about that were no natives allowed, natives get out. And so in the Alaska community, they prefer to be called indigenous or Alaskan communities. And I just learned that earlier this summer. So, but for this treaty making period, the US made around 500 tribal treaties Every single one has been violated or simply broken by the United States government. In all of US history, there's only one treaty that was ever broken by a tribe, and it was by one of the tribes in Texas during the Spanish-American War, in which they sided with Mexico because their territory really fell in that region. But that was the only time that a tribe broke a treaty. Every single treaty was broken actually by the United States. From 1867 into the 1900s, so it overlaps with that treaty making period, you get into the assimilation era. And in the assimilation area, this is when they were trying to make people into the image of a European settler, trying to make them cut their hair, dress like settlers, learn English, give up their religion and convert to Christianity. Then in part of that was the Indian Removal Act, which was signed by Andrew Jackson on May 28th of 1830. Most people know this is what initiated the Trail of Tears, where tribes were forcefully migrated, which is a really nice way to talk about what was actually a horrific death march in many cases, where they were made to walk from Georgia and the Carolinas all the way west of the Mississippi into Oklahoma. To give a little perspective, driving in my car, it would take me about 11 hours to get from where I live just outside of Madison to the Anadarko region where the Wichita affiliated tribes are located. And these people walked that. The walk began in the fall so that they were walking in the wintertime with inadequate food and shelter. It killed thousands of people. And despite these deaths, removal of Indian people from their traditional homelands was supported all the way through the next presidency in the 1840s. Then within this same time period, you also had the Dawes Act, which is also called the Allotment Act, was made official in 1887. It offered citizenship in exchange for disassociation for a tribe. So the intent was to destroy tribal communities and destroy tribal land ownership by dissolving the concept of a tribe and then breaking their land up into allotments. Often what was used politically was, well, Indians didn't need all this land, which was just an excuse to say that the United States wanted to colonize it and break up these different homelands and take more land for themselves while putting tribal people on smaller and smaller plots, which were actual allotments. And I have been doing research. I actually have a tribal connection in my own family. A lot of people do, but on my father's side, his grandmother was the last full-blooded Native person. I always thought that they were Eastern Cherokee and from that region. And the more digging I've done, there's a question of whether or not they are Cherokee and Choctaw. And I did receive some records back from the Oklahoma Historical Society. And in that, there is a very sad story of this family who appear to be related to me. I'm trying to confirm the rest of the details. Were forcibly moved. They actually agreed to move from where they were from in that southeastern corner and go to Oklahoma. On the way, once they were there, the father, who was only in his 30s, had become ill after a point in time. They had a daughter who looks like that's my great-grandmother, and her name was Delia with an IA. They also gave them all Americanized names. And so when you read paperwork, no one even attempted to record what their tribal names were and just and their own names they couldn't write were X's on the paper. Forward along, and the homestead that they had under the Dawes Act, they had to record everything. So they had to report when their daughter was born, and it had to be recognized. There weren't birth certificates at this time. It had to be recognized by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and recorded that a child had been born to them and what the name was, et cetera, and witnessed. Well, there's a spelling error of whether her name is Della or Delia. And when her father died and her mother went to apply for a land allotment in the daughter's name so that they would have a place to live, there's an official letter from the Indian Affairs Office saying that they don't have a record of a child born to them under the name of Della, even though it's clearly a typo of one letter's difference. And so they were turned away from having a land allotment. And then right on the heels of that, a white man who was a settler showed up with a letter that he claimed had been witnessed before the father had died, and that he had given all of his land and holdings to this man for, and I quote, being such a good friend to the Indians, and left his daughter and his wife and their other children with $50 and no place to live. So that's just a couple of generations removed from me. And that was under the Dawes Act, which was offering this, really a poor exchange of, look, you can be citizens if you'll just give us all your land and disband your tribes. And one of the things that we'll talk about again is, when you think about that citizenship and what that means, you have to be a citizen to be able to vote. You have to be a citizen often to own a business and do so many different transactions, and tribes were deprived of that right in a country that was really their own. So then you move into the boarding school period during this time as well, where you had that continuation of that religious indoctrination. And the most infamous boarding school is the Carlisle Boarding School, which was founded by a man named Richard Henry Pratt, who was also a military hero. And he began the first of the boarding schools, but his policy, he gave a very famous speech, and his policy was kill the Indian to save the man. So make everyone not be an Indian anymore in order to save them, because they were somehow other, they were somehow savages and needed to be saved. In those boarding schools, there were actually 10 different Indian boarding schools just in Wisconsin alone. There was one located in Hayward, in Lac du Flambeau, and Oneida. And just to give you a little perspective on that boarding school period, even though we don't have it on our timeline here, the last boarding school in the United States for Indian children closed in 1973. So that means, from a perspective of dealing with people who have Alzheimer's and dementia and just other aging and disability cases, a 3-year-old Native child who would have been sent to one of these boarding schools in 1945 would be an elder in their 70s right now. So that means that all of your Native clients are either direct survivors of a boarding school, or they're the immediate family member of people who went to boarding schools. And that kind of trauma, we often know with memory loss associated with Alzheimer's and dementia, that people sometimes regress, and that past is more present for them than what's going on right now. So now imagine that what you're reliving is this kind of assimilation and boarding school past, and struggling with Alzheimer's and dementia. And Mary, I'll turn the reorganization over to you, unless you want me to keep going.
Oh, please keep going. You're the history buff. I just love listening to you.
Is that the nice way of saying, yeah, you take all these boring details away? So then we move in our timeline, we get to the reorganization period, or what's actually called, from a history standpoint, the Indian New Deal. And under this Indian New Deal, everyone's coming back from the Great War, from World War II in the 1920s, or World War I rather. That's the first Great War, is World War I in the 1920s. And Native people, and this continues to today, tribal members are the biggest serving group in the military, like per capita, for their population. And yet they weren't officially citizens of the United States in World War I. And yet they served by the thousands in the Great War. And so part of what the US did when everyone was coming back was to say, well, we're going to create this Indian Citizenship Act, which is also called the Snyder Act, in recognition of the thousands of natives who served in the armed forces. However, it really only covered about 1/3 of the tribal population, and the majority of states did not comply with this. And indigenous people as a whole did not achieve full United States citizenship until 1948. So at that point, you're after World War II. I'm guessing that everyone on this call has either a grandparent or a great-grandparent who served in World War II, or at least that's their time frame of when they were born, or when your parents were born. I think my dad was born in the 1940s. Tribal members still weren't considered citizens in the United States with all of the rights and privileges that citizenship, being a US citizen, would be afforded to you, but they were serving by the thousands in the military in these great wars. So in 1948, when that Citizenship Act was finally passed by all states, it was only done because Arizona and New Mexico, who were the two holdouts, were forced to comply by a Supreme Court judicial ruling. So underneath the Snyder Act, what makes it really important for us in this realm of talking about disabilities and aging and care is that the Snyder Act is where the United States reaffirmed its overall responsibility, and not treaty by treaty, but as a whole, nationwide, for the health and welfare of tribes, and began the first funding set aside specifically for that purpose that would later on become what we know of as the Indian Health Services, or IHS. So in 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act, which was passed under the FDR, so Franklin Delano Roosevelt, this ended those allotments. So this is 1934. So that whole allotment and breaking up tribal lands and trying to get them to disband themselves as communities was really still floating around and continuing at this point, but it was officially ended under the Indian Reorganization Act. And this also was important because it included the policy of self-governance for tribes. So what this meant is that now in 1934, tribes and their people were now allowed to incorporate businesses, establish credit, have enhanced healthcare, education, employment opportunities. Some of their lands were actually restored. Can you guys still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, because I lost my whole display of you guys. So just
Oh.
making sure that nothing went down, since you guys can't see me anyway. So it really solidified tribes at tribal right to their right to exist within the United States as a separate culture, and tribal councils were formally recognized with a nation-to-nation status on par with the federal government. So when you hear tribes talk about consultation, or especially from leadership where they say, was there consultation on that? That's something that is between tribes and the federal government, and then down a level, tribes and states. Sovereign to sovereign, government to government, that a tribal government, even no matter how small or how large a tribe is, how great or small their constituency, they are their own independent nation with all of those rights reserved and preserved in federal law, recognizing them as a government on par with the United States of America. So these good things start to happen. But again, I just want to keep pointing out, and I'm going to keep picking at it all through this. Look at the dates. So 1934 is when FDR establishes this. And at this point, slavery has been over for almost 70 years, almost a generation. But tribal people still couldn't own businesses, have credit, and higher education, and organize healthcare. So termination and relocation, and we call this assimilation part 2. And the reason being is during that assimilation era, again, I can't talk, so thank you for being patient with me today. During that assimilation era of when, you know, children were being sent to boarding schools and everyone was being told, you can't have your long hair, you can't dress this way, you can't have your traditional music or ceremonies. You can't, even if you were children sent to boarding schools, they were often not allowed, not often, it was more often than not. They couldn't have toys. They couldn't go home for holidays or ceremonies with their family. And these were children as young as the age of 3. I cannot, as a mother and also as a human being, imagine denying toys and visits home to a toddler. But that's what was happening. That was assimilation, and it was supposed to save the Indian from from themselves. Well, then in 1953, we had kind of a second go around of the United States trying to get tribes to assimilate again. This started with the termination period. This is when the federal government began terminating tribes of their federal status, which then stripped their lands as well, stripped all provisions for them, and ordered the collapse and disbanding of their governing bodies. This decimated over 100 plus tribes. Menominee was actually terminated at the same time as Brotherton, but only Menominee was reinstated a little over a decade later. So to put a even more modern and fine point on it, during the last federal administration, right at the outbreak of the pandemic, there were personal interests of the past president that involved gaming in an area that is owned by one of the tribal nations. And it's it's like the mash paquette. I'm going to butcher it, so I won't even try, but they are the tribe that actually owned Manhattan and are one of the first tribes that colonizers met when they came to this country. And this previous administration in the White House was going to terminate them. You can go and look this up. It's very well documented, terminate them at the start of the pandemic. By terminating them like that and stripping them of their rights, and it was a political move in order to open up some land and territory and some other regulations to development that administration wanted to do. But what that would have done at the beginning of the pandemic, had it succeeded, would have stripped every man, woman, and child of all ages of the protections and ability to get Indian health services and have vaccinations, access to COVID services in places, because they would cease to be eligible for Indian health services at the outbreak of a pandemic. So in 1953, right on, like during this termination and second assimilation period, the United States then also passed something called Public Law 280. This was passed in 1953, and it gave certain states, it's a handful of states, but it includes Wisconsin and Minnesota, criminal and civil jurisdiction on tribal land. So due to Menominee being terminated before and then reinstated after 1953, they're exempt. They're the only tribe in Wisconsin that's exempt from Public Law 280. So why is this a big deal? Well, this criminal and civil jurisdiction, besides infringing on the tribe's rights to govern themselves, right, which is preserved in that law just 20 years prior to that, besides being an affront to that, but now this means that crossing jurisdictions like this makes prosecuting certain crimes, such as murder and trafficking, more difficult to pursue in a timely manner. Because as anybody who's ever watched a crime show knows, the first 48 hours are imperative in order to set up the scene, establish whose jurisdiction it is. Usually when you're watching one of these TV shows, is it a federal crime? Is it a state crime? So is it going to fall within that local municipality, or do they have to call in the state police, or is it the FBI? Well, now you have crimes that could happen on tribal territory, and depending on what it is, such as a murder or human trafficking, they're wasting that first 48 hours and then some, just trying to determine whose jurisdiction it falls under in order to send in the appropriate law enforcement to set the scene. So there have been recent efforts of the federal governments to recognize that there needs to be federal assistance in missing, murdered, and Indigenous women. However, even with that federal assistance, until this changes with Public Law 280, there's still going to be this muddy water of whose jurisdiction does this fall under, and you're going to lose critical time, which for Alzheimer's and dementia patients means that, you could also lose some time if someone goes missing, because then there's a question of how long they're missing and whose jurisdiction does some of this fall under. Now, for missing people like that usually just falls under local laws and then requires coordination between the tribe, because many tribes have their own law enforcement and what the local law enforcement is in a county or a city. But when it comes to something more serious, then there's actually a chart to say which things fall into which jurisdiction. And by the time you figure it out, you've lost critical time. So in 1955, the Indian Health Service was created in full. Remember, it was funded in the 20s under the Snyder Act, but it hadn't fully developed to become the Indian Health Service until 1955. However, as of today's date, IHS has never been fully funded to its level of need, and it remains around 44 to 52% funded to need. And it does not include funding for long-term services and support or home and community-based services, which is where dementia often falls. There is a noted need for Alzheimer's and dementia funding at the federal level for the Indian Health Service. However, until recently, there was $0 applied to that. There was Mary, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was $5 million that went into that about a year ago. And I'm sure some of these grants that are happening with ACL, they're not connected to that funding, but that IHS is watching how those grants are going to go to look for some best practices and places to invest that $5 million, because $5 million across 500 plus tribes in all of the United States does not go very far. In 1956, you have this is the really almost like the second Trail of Tears in some ways. It's the Indian Relocation Act of 1956. It's also called the Adult Vocational Training Program, though how vocational training and relocation, really can interact. But it's Public Law 959, and it was enacted in 1956, and it was intended to encourage tribal members to leave their traditional lands and assimilate again into the general population, but this time in urban areas. The federal government promised job training, housing assistance, and other benefits. However, none of those promises were delivered, and it left many, if not most people, stranded in unfamiliar urban areas, and now without resources and without a connection to their tribal community, which, besides providing that emotional and mental health support, were also providing certain financial and services supports. And now they were often hundreds of miles away, and their tribe was unable to reach them in that urban setting. So there are many, many elders that are currently living in urban settings today who struggle with interacting with those local government managed care systems, especially around Alzheimer's and dementia. So making sure that we're connecting back with the urban Indian centers for outreach is super important to keeping our members who may be struggling with Alzheimer's and dementia related illnesses connected to their heritage, and just also ensuring a better continuum of care that includes cultural supports for them. Then it gets better. Are you sure you don't want to talk about this part, Mary, where it's like the really good stuff under
Sure. Yeah. Well,
so Mary gets the nice blue square.
I was just thinking, though, that that's probably how my family ended up out in Portland after the war, because my father, his brother, they were promised jobs to go out into the Portland area and left Wisconsin and moved out west. And so we actually ended up being out there, raised partially out in Oregon. And then he got a job with the government, and then we ended up in Arizona before ever coming back here to the homelands. So yeah, that quite disrupted our family. Okay, Indian self-determination in the 60s and 70s were the human rights movements, and that included tribes. That was the rise of the American Indian movement and other activists who promoted equality for Indigenous people. Native Americans won the right to vote at that time, state by state, and the last state to allow this or to win this was New Mexico in 1962.
So Mary, can I cut in just 2 seconds?
Sure.
So just to tie this back, when we talked about no one became full citizens until the 1940s, it still took another 20 years
to get the right
for them to get the vote. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 helped to strengthen voting rights, but in 2018, North Dakota Supreme Court ruled in favor of a new requirement of proof of residency that prevented many from being able to vote. So it's still happening. There's a lot of people that are living out in North Dakota that do not have a physical address. It is so rural. They don't have that ability.
Yeah, there's
Then
no,
Go
the
ahead.
post office, I was just gonna say, the post office itself set up those PO box addresses because they don't have a physical system in those areas. And then the Supreme Court of the state approved a requirement that you couldn't have a PO box listed as your residence, even though the entire state knows that in these particular reservations, no street address exists with the post office.
Then Congress passed the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act in 1975 that allowed Indian tribes and tribal organizations to acquire increased control over the management of federal programs that impact their members, resources, and governments. And these agreements are referred to as 638 compacts and contracts. Then in 1978, this is my big year. In 1978, that was the big year of policy changes. The American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978 was passed. And I just was reading this morning that this was passed by, signed into law by President Jimmy Carter. He's so awesome. But anyway, this Indian Religious Freedom Act protects the rights of Native Americans to exercise their traditional religions by ensuring access to sites, use and possession of sacred objects, and the freedom to worship through ceremonies and traditional rites. A joint resolution of Congress, the Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978, states that it shall be the policy of the United States to protect and preserve for American Indians their inherent right of freedom to believe, express, and exercise the traditional religions of the American Indian. But you know what's really odd, or yeah, I guess odd, that's how our whole nation was founded, was that they wanted religious freedom. And then to stifle that up until just 1978. Also in that year, Title VI was amended for Native Americans to have Older Americans Act funding. And this was also the year that Indian Child Welfare Act was passed. Do you want to talk about ICWA?
Sure, because we're going to touch on that again later on. But the reason that that is such a big deal is that Indian Child Welfare Act, which sometimes is called ICWA, passed in 1978. It essentially says, hey, states, it's not okay to take Indian children from their homes and from their communities and give them away to non-tribal, predominantly white families and strip them of their culture. Instead, you have to respect the rights of the tribe as a sovereign and work with them as a government agency, and that they have special provisions to keep you from stealing their children from their homes. I had someone from Lac du Flambeau share with me and give me permission to share this story in this presentation, that, you know, she can remember being a kid, because again, this is 1978. I'm 48 years old. I was born in April of 1973. So this is within my lifetime. This is actually the year that my younger sister was born. So within my lifetime, this was ended. So prior to that, it was perfectly fine for someone to come in from outside of a community and just leave with children who sometimes never came back. And what this person from Lac du Flambeau shared with me is that she could remember when the county social worker would come to the village of Lac du Flambeau and everyone knew his name, and that the children would go running from house to house to alert everybody that this person was coming to town, because whenever they were there, they always took at least one or more children back with them. And the tribe often either never saw them again, or when they did come back, they'd suffered such horrible abuse within the foster system that they were just never the same by the time they came back to their tribe. So that's within our lifetime. So again, when we talk about, you know, this all being history, and the history of assimilation and the history of the struggle for equity, it's not history like cave people that happened thousands of years ago and no one remembers. This is people's parents, grandparents, great grandparents, and it's happening now.
Thank you.
And speaking of it being families, is Mary's going to share some of her family's experience, and she gave us some wonderful photographs.
Yeah. This is a picture of my grandmother's class where she was in boarding school, and she is in the middle row, second one in from the left. That's my grandmother, Filipina. And 3 of my 4 grandparents were all in boarding schools, where they were all taken from their families and put into boarding schools. My grandmother, Phil, was actually sent to Fort Shaw, which was in Montana. And while she was there, she went in, I believe she was about 5 years old when she was sent to boarding school. And while she was there, her parents heard that they had performed brain surgery on her. But they had performed brain surgery on not just her, but some other girls too. And it was probably a year afterwards, she said that she was the only one that was able to still see and speak and walk. Some of the girls didn't make it at all. Others were left with impairments like that. But this type of thing, experimental brain surgery, was conducted without the parental consent that we have in place today. You know, for any type of medical procedures, we always get the consent first. But back then, they just did their experiments on the students. Next.
Yep, I'm waiting for it to, there it goes.
All right. Now on the other side of my family, on my father's side, this is, oh, you didn't take that out. Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I did.
This is my great grandfather, and his English name is Peter, but they refer to him as Ingen, which is translated into wolf, means wolf in English. And he was the last recognized hereditary chief of Lakota. And we follow the patrilineal side of our clans. And so I am also of the Crane clan, just as my great grandfather was. And he promoted the 7 grandfather teachings, which are the 7 grandfather teachings are wisdom, love, respect, bravery, honesty, humility, and truth. And this is something that we could all learn to incorporate into our lives, I think.
Absolutely. And I'm sorry about that, Mary. I had more than one version of this saved. So this is the one that where I hadn't changed it yet. My apologies. I have us both talking about sovereignty. Do you want to talk a little bit about sovereignty from like your perspective as being a tribal member and a tribal elder?
Oh.
Or you want me to kick it off?
Go ahead, kick it off.
So we've already talked about the fact that tribes are, you know, individual governments that have sovereign rights, you know, equivalent to the federal government into a state. But we wanted to break some of that down into what it meant from a health aspect as well, which is, and so we kind of broke it down into what tribes can do as a government, what are their special provisions, and then how does that impact state Medicaid? And the reason that we included state Medicaid is because that's where the waiver services live. And that's what is the supportive care for people who are frail elders, who have differing disabilities or other needs, which could include someone who has Alzheimer's or dementia related illness, that they could be qualified and eligible to have these additional supports. So from the government oversight, tribes are able to provide and oversee programs directly. So even if it is is a Medicaid program, a tribe could operate as much of that program as a state assigns or allows them to, where the tribe as a government would enter into a contract with the state and then take on different responsibilities. And in Wisconsin, you have the tribes, most, if not all of the tribes have their own economic support, income maintenance units. They are all have aging programs for Title VI. Several of them also operate aging and disability programs similar to an ADRC. Most of the tribes also have their own aging and disability resource specialist. That's like the ADRS that works out of the ADRC, only they're embedded with the tribe, and that's their focus, is the tribal community. And they answer back to a supervisor with the tribe. Now, there's a unique tribal ADRS right now. 2 tribes decided to enter into a cooperative agreement with Great Lakes InterTribal Council in order to pool their resources and make sure that they have an ADRS who meets all of the qualifications for the functional screen and some of the other higher level assessments that have different educational requirements. Those 2 tribes also partnered with Great Lakes on a dementia care specialist for the tribes. So tribes also have their own dementia care specialists as well. So many tribes and Great Lakes operate as a different version of an ADRC. But tribes have all of these authorities that they can access data. They're a covered entity under HIPAA. In fact, they're named like 11 different times, I believe, is the last time I counted, plus specifically called out as a covered entity under the privacy rule of HIPAA that states that they're to be treated as a public health authority. All 11 tribes here in Wisconsin own and operate their own clinic and wellness center. They all own and operate a community or public health program. They all have that aging Title VI program. So we have a really well-developed tribal infrastructure in Wisconsin, where all 11 tribes really are these different agencies equivalent to the state or equivalent to the county. And it's important that we all try and coordinate together to give the best continuum of care for clients and their families.
May I interject?
Oh, yeah,
here?
Of course.
Okay, I would also like everyone to know that when tribal members have Indian Health Service services, helping them when they're in these long-term care programs through Medicaid, those services are allowed to be counted as part of their cost share.
Oh, do you want me to say a little bit about that?
If you would, please.
Sure. So there has been some differing and not correct information happening statewide, depending on the different consortia area and county, about cost shares. So what's been happening is that when a tribal member comes in and has that long-term care cost share or that spend down in order to be part of family care IRAS, tribes absolutely have the preserved right under the Social Security Act and other federal law to pay that cost share on behalf of their members. And that cost share is not allowed to be counted back into that individual's income. So if you want to see more specifics on it, one of the easiest and broken down pieces of information is actually from the IRS. Believe it or not, this is the one thing that's easy to understand from the IRS. And it's under 138E, and if it's not 138E, it's 139E, but I'm pretty sure it's 38. And that is the Tribal General Health and Welfare Exclusion Act. And it outlines what's already provided for in other federal regulations, which is that tribes as a government can absolutely pay for these certain services for their members. They can use tribal per capita to pay for these, or they can use gaming revenue. However, you cannot rename per caps into general health and welfare funds, but you can use tribal gaming revenues to pay for this. And it again is not to be included back into a member's income and re-elevate their cost share. It's meant to reduce or eliminate their cost share to allow the tribe to pay for that, so that more members can access care and close the equity gap that tribes continue to face. Did I do it justice, Mary?
You sure did. Thank you.
Okay. So, one of the things about these programs, and when it comes to Medicaid and long-term care and home and community-based services, is that we know for a fact, it's well-documented data that tribal members tend to overqualify for Medicaid and state government funded programs and yet underutilize them. And there are a variety of reasons for this. Some of that has to do with access and the challenges that tribal members face trying to access programs at a county or a state level, especially when not everyone is aware of what the special provisions are for tribes. Also, most of these non-tribal agency offices are located a significant distance from reservations and native communities. I mean, part of what that assimilation and moving tribes out of their ancestral homes did was really stuck tribes and their communities in the furthest reaches. And where cities and other things have developed tend to be removed from where a tribal community may be. And there may not be public transportation or any kind of rideshare opportunity for someone to be able to get into that county office and complete paperwork. And some people may not have access to the internet because, again, either they simply don't have it, maybe they don't have a computer or even a cell phone. But the other piece of that is there may not be a connection where they are. During COVID, some tribal offices that were more remotely located, when they were closed during COVID, their staff were unable to work from a distance because they didn't have an internet connection to be able to get in to their office site and continue working. And so the tribe essentially shut down for a period of time. Also, many state and county agencies are unaware of what the federal provisions are overall, not just for tribal members participating in the program, but for tribes as providers of those services, the fact that those are agencies. Now, in Wisconsin, there have been, just in the last couple of years, with some of the staff changes in ORCID, there have been some really big strides to adapt and update the contract that the state has with the tribes and with Great Lakes InterTribal Council as an agency on behalf of certain tribes, of what it means to have the ADRS, what it means to have the DCS, and be the administrator of those programs. So anyone on this call who works with a county agency, if you are not aware that contract and the scope of work changed and was updated, I highly recommend that you reach out to Jennifer Spakeen or to Tom Balsley or Carrie Mulkey and get a copy of that current scope of work and that current contract that the state has, because it really updated a lot of the language, outlined what tribes do and do not do, how they operate, and what it means to work with the tribal agency, between the tribal agency and the county ADRC. Also, a lot of the assessments, like the long-term care functional screen, as well as the mini-cog testing, these are really not, well, first off, they're administered and maintained usually at a non-tribal agency. And the formatting of those things are really not culturally relevant or congruent. Like, so to take it all the way back to the beginning, when Mary was talking about, congruency being how we deliver a service, the way questions are asked, the types of questions they're asked, and even who is asking the question is really not culturally congruent for tribal clients in this state. I've actually been trained on the mini cog here in Wisconsin. I've seen it, I've looked at it. I was already aware of those all of my staff are all trained dementia generalists. And we also have a couple of social workers as well who are trained for the provider piece. So we're very familiar with Alzheimer's and dementia at ACS. And so we look at these things all the time. And, these aren't challenges just to Wisconsin, it's across the country. A woman by the name of Dr. Blythe Winchester, she is one of the nationwide experts on Indian aging and gerontology. She is the lead gerontologist for Eastern Cherokee out in the Carolinas. And she's been working on a nationwide level to actually create an adaptation of the mini cognition tests for Alzheimer's and dementia-related illness, simply to make them relevant to tribal members. So oftentimes when you're reviewing things with a client and their family, trying to screen for Alzheimer's and dementia, it's really good to involve the tribal agency, especially if that's a tribe that doesn't have a tribal DCS, because not every tribe in Wisconsin has a tribal DCS. I think there are only five of them, Mary, 4 or 5 of them across 6 tribes, and one of them is the shared position. Does that sound right?
Yes, yes.
But there are 11 tribes in the state. Well, 11 recognized tribes, but now there are actually 12 tribal communities in the state. So less than half of them have their own dementia care specialist. And this is a piece where people are getting misdiagnosed and slipping through the cracks. One of the things that's important to know about these tests and screens is that, for a while, it was thought that, for some reason, tribal members just didn't develop Alzheimer's until later in life. In fact, I was at a national convention in like 2014 or 15, and that was a talk that was being given, and the speaker was someone from the UW here. And that they made the comment that for an unknown reason that tribal members didn't appear to develop dementia until much later than other populations, and no one was sure why. However, since that time, and actually it was starting to emerge at that time as well, that it's not that they develop it later, it's that the whole setup of a tribal community, which is geared to take care of elders first and people in need, was insulating families from getting that Alzheimer's diagnosis because someone was taking care of dad or even their neighbor or a grandmother and making sure they had things like food or had their lawn mowed. And so it's allowed people to really go without that Alzheimer's or dementia diagnosis much longer, even though it was present and possibly present earlier than the general population. So just at the end of 2019 and again in 2018, the CDC actually released some information about cognitive decline in tribal communities, finding that actually tribal members were more likely to suffer from cognitive decline at much earlier ages, beginning in their 40s and 50s. So in complete contradiction to, oh, we think that tribal members get this disease later and we don't know why. Instead, it was, we're missing it and it's going undetected. And so they're not getting help until they're in the later stages of the disease, and that tribal community or that family can no longer support that member the way they need to. And then they go outside of the tribal system, and that's when they're getting that diagnosis, which is what makes connecting with those tribal DCS and the tribal ADRS so important. And Glitzy's work on Together Strong to adapt those materials right here in Wisconsin are just going to really improve those services and screenings for tribal members. So, and all of this, there still continues to be this unmet need for Alzheimer's and dementia support and outreach within tribal communities. We're starting to make some headway. Glitzy has Together Strong. You have tribes that have the tribal DCS, where the state of Wisconsin has carved out a tribal aspect in their ADPI grants, and that's made a huge difference, but it's just a drop in the bucket. When we talked a little earlier about Title VI and the funding that's given to tribes, it's supposed to be an equal access with Title III, but it isn't at all. There's still this gigantic inequity of funding. Recently, N4A did a survey of the Title VI programs nationwide, and they found that out of the reported need that these programs were saying, we need Alzheimer's and dementia related outreach and support, only 14% of that need was actually being funded by Title VI. And for tribes right now, all of the different dementia funding and other programs that exist at a federal or a state level, other than Wisconsin's DCS program, and what the ACL has recently done with these 4 or 5 DPI grants, there is no federal funding for long-term services and supports, home and community-based care. And and where dementia blends into all of that, that doesn't exist for Indian country. Certainly not in the same way. And you can't talk about these things and about this inequity without talking about trauma, right? And we talked a little bit about the boarding school piece, and these inequities, but what's that really mean? I mean, I'm assuming everyone on this call has at least once been on a recent, or at least within the past 2 years, presentation talking about trauma-informed care and what it means to have traumatized people. But we don't see enough about what it means to be working with an entire traumatized population, that an entire group of people, Native Americans to be specific, are a traumatized population, and that means something in regards to how that affects them for greater rates of disability and illness and earlier death. And as you can see from this slide, we have resources, we have our citation list and resources at the very end of this. So this is actually a real statistic. And in fact, we should probably amend this, Mary, because I just looked up this information for something else recently. And now it's not 3 to 4, it's a solid 4 moving into a 5% higher rate on average. The most recent place that you can look at a federal level for those disability numbers and impacts are at the Division of Labor. They actually sent out a report in November of 2019 that was all about Native Americans and Alaskan Natives in the workforce and how disability impacted their ability to participate in the workforce. And it was 4 to 5% higher than the national average for all races and ethnicities. So any person of color and differing culture in the United States has some kind of trauma experience. And when we put this together, you know, it's never meant to say one is worse than another, but we're talking about an entire population of people who weren't allowed to vote until the 1960s, who were still having their children taken from them and removed from the home, all the way into, well, really into the early 1980s, because even though ICWA was 1978, anyone who's worked in policy knows that it probably took a year or two for that to trickle down. So we thought it was very important to talk a little bit about what that trauma means in our time and touch on some of these events. We talked, you'll see these 2 images, and I'll start this, and then Mary has some things to say about what has happened like in her area and recently. We talked about that boarding school piece in ICWA, but this letter right here is, it's actually from, I want to say this is the Sisseton, is this one the Sisseton Indian Missionary? It's in South Dakota, and you could essentially, for a donation of $10, you could get an Indian child to come live with you for the summer. I would love to think that it was an enrichment program and they were having people, you know, kids get some good experience of living somewhere else and having access to different services. But the truth is that often they were given to non-Native people as servants and housekeepers, sometimes adopted without consent of parents. And this wasn't prohibited under law until 1978. So, you know, when then you move into, and now putting this into that whole, well, what does this mean for people with Alzheimer's and dementia? Again, you're talking about people who may have gone through this, that this trauma is an aspect of them, that you're likely to see certain behaviors come out as they get further into a cognitive decline state, where this is still a part of their physical memory. This is a part of that body wide. If anybody's read, you know, Bessel van de Kolk, you know, The Body Keeps the Score. This is the very essence of trauma-informed care. So in the 1970s, right before ICWA was passed, there was a UN report specifically about the United States, because the United States had a very healthy and horrifying practice of involuntarily sterilizing women and children. And I mean children, because some of them were as young as 11, that were sterilized without their knowledge, certainly without parental consent. It wasn't uncommon that that a child would go in for an appendectomy. That was a big one. You'd go in because your appendix ruptured and you left without an appendix or a uterus. And it was so commonplace that it's an approximation of over 100,000 women and children who were affected by this, and it reduced the US native population by almost a quarter. So this is something that's still impacting tribes today. That the real estimate is that that IHS and other collaborating physicians performed sterilizations on really between 25 to 40% of the population, resulting in a dramatic reduction in numbers, which can really only be called genocide. If we were looking at that and looking at this happening somewhere like Rwanda or Somalia or somewhere else, we would call this genocide, but this happened right here and all the way into the 1970s and 80s. So you may have people who suffered this very real physical trauma and are now struggling with Alzheimer's and dementia. And so trusting you and trusting someone that comes from outside their community is going to be very difficult. But it's not just ancient history, unfortunately. That little picture to the right, I'll let Mary tell you a little bit more about this, but that's from the Walleye Wars that didn't end until the 1990s. And I graduated high school in 1991. And this is from one of the protests that happened, I think in 90 or 91. You can go and Google this image and find it. You can just look up the Walleye Wars that were here in Wisconsin, and it was all over fishing rights.
Yeah, I wanted to share that. A bit of this is still going on here at Lac du Flambeau last year. I believe it was May of last year. There was some spear fishermen out local lakes here, and they spear at night so that they can see the reflection of the fish while they're down there. And so one of the landowners, I guess you might say, the people that have bought up lakeshore property, took a shot at him and was shooting at them. And I've heard others say that this happens frequently, that they've had experiences. And what's scary is that sometimes they have their children in the boats with them to be teaching them how to do spearfishing. But this guy, thanks to modern technology, they were able to zero in on his property with the cell phone and be able to track it and report it. Law enforcement went there, and the person was drinking, had a firearm, and he lied to them saying he thought it was a squirrel or something that he was shooting at. His mistake. Anyway, I guess it went to court, but the guy really wasn't seriously reprimanded for what he did, other than he's not supposed to be shooting a gun or have access to a gun if he's going to be drinking, something like that. So it enraged a lot of people in the area that want to continue their treaty rights, of providing for their families and the tribe by doing spearfishing. So just wanted to share that this is still going on.
And another reason that's also important is that part of this subsistence living is what it's called, when tribes are exercising their treaty rights to hunt or fish on certain property. Tribes then become sort of the game and wildlife caretakers in some of those areas. Like Ho-Chunk can tell you how many fish are stocked, because they take a share, but then they also track how many are in there, when there's a spawning season, things like that. And often these shares, it's not just, I felt like I needed to go and fish. It's also people who are, as Mary said, feeding their families. A lot of times this is traditional diets that go back to an elder center, because Title VI will actually pay for traditional food gathering and putting that back into an aging program, in part because it's better overall health for all people when they eat more of a traditional diet. But it is actually scientifically proven to impact and improve Alzheimer's and dementia outcomes when Native people are eating their traditional foods diets. There's a really fantastic program up in Alaska that's done a whole lot with reintroducing native foods. And what it's done is I highly recommend that people go out and look for some of that information, because it's really, it's heartwarming to hear people get so excited and say, oh, I've not tasted seal since, I was a kid, and and it brings back these positive memories and experiences of, I used to do this with my grandmother or my grandfather, or my father took me here or there, because food has this powerful memory, as well as all of these health and wellness benefits. And what these Alaska regions were finding is that people needed less medication. They were having better social interactions and outcomes. And so it was just really elevating their quality of life and health to go back to a traditional foods diet. So, but you can't do that if you don't have access to it. And tribes are guaranteed these by treaty. So just a little brief, to get all science nerd about the trauma and the generational illness and disability. One of the things that science knows about trauma is that experiencing a traumatic event actually changes our methylation. Think of methylation like the garbage carrier. It's like the garbage truck of your system. And methylation impacts how DNA is expressed. So it actually acts as like an on and off switch for disease risks. And when your methylation changes due to trauma, you are more likely to hit the on switch for risk factors. And methylation, that traumatic change of methylation, is actually passed on genetically directly from mother to child, and then so forth. So now let's dial that into Alzheimer's and dementia and say, how many people are more at risk across the entire country of all Indigenous communities, because that trauma really hasn't stopped since the 1660s. And it's just passed on from one generation to the next. And we see it play out in all these elevated rates of chronic illness and disease, which includes traumatic brain injuries, risks for stroke, risks for diabetes are extremely high in tribal communities, which we know is a risk factor for Alzheimer's and dementia, let alone just carrying that gene, at those Alzheimer's and dementia related genes, and passing them on from one generation to the next.
Elaina, can I break in here?
Absolutely.
We only have 5 minutes left, and we'd like
Ooh.
to do some question answers. So
yeah, I think what we have left here is really just, we wrap up with realizing the differences. So this is not a bad breaking point if that's what we want to do. We just always come with so much information.
Yeah, I know.
But we wind up with saying it's really important to collaborate. Don't make a plan about us without us.
Mm-hmm.
So I will stop sharing this so that you can have some question and answer time, so I can figure this out. Please, do what you need to while I fumble around with this.
Okay, and then for myself, even when I'm in the meetings with the state people, at DHS, like meeting with Orchid or something, when they bring up policies or changes that are going to be impacting our delivery of tribal to our tribal audiences, to our tribal participants, my first question is to was there consultation? So a lot of times, our different government agencies might need a reminder that yes, we need to have that tribal voice. But on the other hand, we also need the tribes to have that voice at the table. They need to have leadership participate in these decisions. We need that voice, because it's really an injustice, I would say, to have decisions made that will affect our tribes without our tribal input, because sometimes we just cannot deliver things the way the American culture says to deliver them is not the way that's going to be workable in tribal communities. So just to look at this, here's a comparison that we've come up with about the tribal way. When I first moved back up here from Arizona, I was very, this is this is who I am, this is my credentials, and this is what I do, this is my career. And the elders weren't considering or weren't interested in that. They'd stop me and they'd say, who's your family? What community are you from? And that was more important, and to get the connections that way, rather than having someone come in and say, here, I've got a program for you, here you go. They want to know, what is my connection with my community? And that is why we rely heavily on our tribal aging and disability resource specialists, our tribal dementia care specialists. We need to have our tribal people help us with delivering services. We need to have that. And we're all wanting the same thing. We all want to serve this person the best way possible. So I just wanted to put that comparison out there. I've lived through it. I've lived in both worlds, and now I'm trying to straddle it and be in both worlds.
Yeah, and just so you know, I
Go ahead.
can't see any of the controls. So I'm afraid to try and shut this down and then lose my connection. So
Oh,
I
I
can't
see.
read the chat either.
Okay, what's in the chat? Laura posted, please take a moment to complete the evaluation of the program. And you can also sign up to receive a certificate of attendance on this link. And so check your chat. Laura's got the survey right there.
And then I've also made it so people can unmute and raise their hands if they like, if they have any questions outside of the chat box. So we have a small group. So if anyone has any questions, we can just unmute.
Hi, this is Kathy. Mary and Elaina for sharing some really good information today. I think it's important for us to learn about culture and the importance of historical trauma in our community, the mistrust. But I also want to take a minute to thank you about the cost share information. That was really good information because that's impacting our community here, our tribal community here, and we like to get that resolved. So those that can utilize that, it's available to them so that they can readily receive services. So make good for that.
Sure, you're welcome. We are working with DHS to try and get this information out to everybody so that we're all on the same page.
Very good.
Kathy raised a hand. Kathy. I'm trying to find you. Where are you? Oh, here you are.
Thank you for having this. This is holy cow, lots of information. So I want to thank Mary and Elaina and everyone else that put this together. I greatly appreciate it. Is the recording and or the PowerPoint going to be shared with people in attendance today? Because my hands hurt from taking notes. So thank you.
We will share both. Please make sure you fill out the evaluation, and there's a place to register for continuing education certificate, and we will send the recording link, and hopefully if Mary and Elaina will send us the PowerPoint, we'll send that also.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. This was fabulous. In my humble opinion, I think you guys could have gone on for at least another hour. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I also want to recognize in the audience, Carrie Lindsay. Thank you for being here. I had a conversation with Carrie several years ago on how to do this. So I'm really glad you're here to see how this has grown. And it's come a long ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary.
And should we, just a little housekeeping, should we send the PowerPoint to Deb Miller, which Deb, thanks for organizing this and reaching out to us to bring us on. You're right, we could have talked for like another hour. I think we probably had like a good 15 to 20 more minutes of stuff. Or should we send this to Laura? Like who does it need to go to so that you can get it?
I'm the one who'll send it out. So if you can send it directly to me, that's great. Otherwise, if it's easier to Deb, she'll get it to me. So whatever is easiest.
You
Could you
know,
fix that one slide first, though, before you
yes,
do?
I will. Yep. The other version I have, Mary, is fixed. So
Okay.
All right. Are there any other comments, questions before we end? I think we're at the 2:30 time.
Thank you for having us. I really appreciate it.
thank you very much.
And we really appreciate your information. I learned a ton today.
Yes, thank you very much.